I know. Yes, I did bring up the house. I would really if there's anything that needs to be back at so I would get there.
Are we on? Yeah, just gonna start the intro opening. Hi everyone, it's so glad to see you guys come here and turn up today. I hope some of you are not coming from too many early morning classes. It's great that you're here. Welcome to the Relevant series. This is our fourth day in the event running it, and today's topic we're gonna be addressing Jesus and the failures of the church. If this is your first Relevant event and you don't know what Relevant is, it's a week-long event made up of different dialogues, talks, and Q&As where we explore life's biggest questions. So that's like intersections between faith, culture, science, and more topics that are relevant to students. And we're so happy that you're here with us today. My name is Marisha. I'm a fourth year student here and I study Christianity and economics. So it's an honor to be hosting this here with you guys. And before we get started, I'm just going to do a quick land acknowledgement. So as a Christian organization, and of this event, we believe all land and all people were created by God. For thousands of years, the land which University of Toronto is situated on has been the traditional land God gave the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. We thank these first peoples who continue to live on these lands and care for them, and whose relationship to these lands existed long before the foundings of Canada. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. And for this lunch talk, we're really looking forward to give you guys the opportunity to ask comfortable, uncomfortable, and challenging questions. And we're going to do that through the platform Slido, which will come up, I think, information how to do that. Yeah, so we're going to go to slido.com and you're going to use the code relevant 2023 and you're going to be able to submit your questions on today's topic. And you can also upvote other questions. So instead of repeating the same question, if you guys see already a question posted that you guys like and you want answered, you can upvote it, and that increases the chances of us being able to get to it and hopefully answer it. And before you guys submit your questions, I'm just going to lay out some ground rules. Don't be afraid to ask challenging questions, but please be respectful and refrain from any personal attacks. And please participate to the fullest of your ability, but also we want to get to as many questions and perspectives as possible. Please speak from your own experiences instead of generalizing, such as using I instead of we, and please refrain from using inappropriate language. And don't be shy. Use this opportunity to ask your specific questions in regards to our topics. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today, Alycia Wood. She has a degree in criminal justice and sociology, and during her undergrad, she discovered apologetics, and it changed the course of her life and her quest for a deeper understanding of Christianity was born. And she has a master's in social justice from Marygrove, and this led to various volunteering opportunities at orphanages, prisons, and shelters for the homeless in several countries, including Haiti, Honduras, Jamaica, and the Dominican Republic. Alycia was a substitute teacher and paraprofessional for multiple grade levels and spent 8 years doing apologetics and ministry before joining the organization Leiden. So without further ado, please welcome Alycia.
Hi, thank you. Well, good afternoon to you all. If you were, how many of you were here yesterday? Okay, I see a bunch of hands. So a lot of you were here when we did another challenging topic, which is the topic of suffering. I'd love to tell you that today is going to be a much more happier and joyful topic. But as you can see behind me, that isn't necessarily the case. The reality is I've been a Christian a long time. For those of you who don't know me, thank you so much for your introduction. I hail from Rochester, New York, just the other side of the Canadian border from you all, and grew up in the church, questioned everything when I got to college. Maybe some of you have that experience. And then, came to the conclusion, nope, Christianity is true, and this is what I believe in. So I am a Christian. But the reason why I'm a Christian is because of the truth of the message of Jesus Christ. And while my entire career, my entire life is going and helping people understand what Christianity teaches, I'm not naive to there's so many words you can use here. Foolishness, atrocities, horrors, evil actions, the list can go on, of people who also are like me, who profess to believe in Jesus Christ and the things that they have done. The word Christian, actually, if you see, you can hear the word Christ in the word Christian, if you want to think of it that way. And the idea of a Christian is that there's someone who is a follower of Jesus Christ. So when you follow somebody, you emulate their behavior, you follow what it is that they do, and that's the direction that you go in. The reality is many Christians take the name Christian, and for a variety of reasons, either through their own self-deception, through their own desires, maybe arrogance, pride, through their own selfishness, greed, through their own whatever, don't look much like the Christ that they are professing to follow. And as a result, we have a lot of atrocities and failures and things that have happened. Maybe you're in this room and you know what I'm talking about because maybe you have had a bad experience in the church. How many of you would say you've had a bad experience in the church or with Christians or with Christian friends or anything along that category? How many of you would say that that's your story? Okay. So there's a lot of people in here that get exactly what I'm talking about. I don't know your individual stories, and I'm sure if I heard them, they would burden me deeply. So what I want to say to you is, in some little insignificant way, knowing that I don't know your situation and I don't know your story, what I do want to say to those of you who have been hurt by the church is, as a person who is a representative of Jesus Christ, who is a Christian, I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the pain that you went through. I'm sorry for the cruelty that you went through. I'm sorry for the injustices and the meanness and the way that people made you feel like you weren't important, you weren't valued, you weren't loved. And sadly, that is the reality of so many lives in this room. So I want you to know that your situation, while it may be something that you know, maybe nobody else in here knows, God knows. And he sees the injustice that happened to you. And he's the God who himself, when he came to earth, experienced injustice. So he knows what it's like. He knows what it's like to have your friends betray you. He knows what it's like to have people that you trusted and loved turn their backs on you. So he knows what you're going through. And I want you to know that he's not okay with any kind of evil acts. He's not okay with any kind of abuse. He's not okay with any kind of horrors that you've had to encounter by someone who was supposed to represent him well. So with that said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different atrocities, horrors that the church has done that are some of the popular ones. I attended the talk last night on the residential schools. I'd heard about what was going on. Just, you know, like I said, I'm from New York, so I'm American, right? We have our own set of issues, which I'll get to in a second. But I'm very familiar with things that have, with some things, I shouldn't say all, with some of the things that have gone on here. And I remember when I was doing research on the residential schools, getting ready for my time here with you, and reading about, you know, how these children were forcibly taken from their families, how they couldn't speak their language, how they were forced to adapt to this culture, how they couldn't even, when they returned, they lost so much of their language and their culture and their assimilation and their relationships. And then you're reading about all the graves, unmarked graves. I want you to understand something about me. I'm a criminal justice major. Okay. I've looked at serial killers. I've walked death row in prisons. I have started out in prison ministry. There's very few crimes, for better, for worse, that move me at this point because I've had to deal with it. But when I was reading about the residential schools, it made me sick. I literally had to stop And I was like, I can't read anymore. I can't hear about this anymore. I can't hear about what happened to these kids. I can't hear about what people did to these kids. Similarly, in my country, we don't have a history of treating people all that great either. Similarly, in my country, just like the residential schools, so many of them were Christian organizations that were supposed to represent Jesus Christ to people and yet abuse them. We have a history of a slave trade. We have a history where we took people and we made them like inanimate objects, like they weren't real, which is classic way of abusing somebody. Oftentimes, and you will see this with certain criminals, oftentimes, in order to abuse somebody, you dehumanize them and you make them an object. Because as long as you see them as a person with value, it's harder for you to hurt them. So you dehumanize them, say they're not like us. You aren't fully human. You're a thing. And we have the US slave trade that took so many people from families and has left scars that literally exist to this day that we are still in fights and battles over. Done in the name of Jesus, because they looked at certain Bible passages and completely misinterpreted them. And they felt justified in what they did. Some Christian theologians and evangelists, so people who go around telling people about Jesus, they haven't always gotten it right either. Many of you might be familiar with a guy named Jonathan Edwards. Very influential theologian. He was a slave owner. He was able to spend so much time studying the Bible and writing his books because he had slaves outside doing the labor for him. George Whitefield was another guy. He was a gentleman who was passionate about telling people about Jesus, traveled beyond America, did a lot in England and traveled around. They said, I forget the numbers, but it may be upwards of 60 to 70% of the people at that time had heard him speak. And this is pre-radio, pre-TV, pre-radio. That's how often he got around. And he decided he wanted to open up an orphanage to help kids in need. Sounds like a great idea. The problem is he wanted to open up that orphanage in Georgia. And so he did, and he realized it was really hard to be able to take care of all these kids and pay all the wages that people needed. But Georgia didn't allow slavery. So what he would do is he would bring slaves from South Carolina over during the day to take care of kids in the orphanage and then send them back at night. Well, even that got to be too much of an inconvenience. And he began to petition for the state of Georgia, which is the state that I live now. He began to petition for them to make slavery legal. And eventually slavery became legal in Georgia because a variety of things, him being one of them. And as if that's not enough, I know that I can look around this room and say there's people who have been maybe abused or hurt physically by people. I remember I was speaking to a friend of mine. She comes from the West Coast of Canada and not a Christian. And I played hockey with her. And I remember saying to her, hey, I would love to talk with you about God because I'm studying these things and I want to get your feedback. You're an atheist. I want you to challenge me on some of the things that I say. And she's like, well, I'd be happy to talk with you as long as you don't yell at me. I'm like, yell at you? Why would I yell at you? She goes, well, when I was growing up in church, when I came out as gay, Christians yelled at me and they told me I was going to hell and they told me I was a horrible person. Wow. Regardless of what somebody feels about what she heard about who she's romantically attracted to, the way that they treated her was wrong. And we ended up having a great relationship, actually. We talked a lot about a variety of things in life, including God. But the reality is some of you may have had bad experiences like that personally, abuses, people mistreating you. So you may be like, how can Jesus be worth it? Why would God allow this? I've just given you a slight surface level view of a lot of the things that have gone wrong in the church. And I'm sure that's left you optimistic and happy. Like, that's what I do, man. I come in here and I make you guys feel better, it seems like, right? But the reality is I don't want to cover things up. I want to put stuff out there because I'm fully aware of it. A former pastor, theologian, author named Brennan Manning, who's since passed away, said this. He said, the greatest single cause of atheism today are Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their words and then walk out the door and deny him with their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. And so you may say, this is why I don't want anything to do with Jesus or Christianity or any of you people. And I get that. But I want to challenge you to maybe be a little bit open today. If it was your birthday and I gave you $100 bill and you were super excited and you were going to go to the store and buy, whatever you want for a $100 bill, and you get there and you pay and they realize, hey, this $100 bill is fake. Now you're going to be pretty annoyed with me that I gave you a fake $100 bill because you got super excited. You thought this was a really good thing. And now you just see I deceived you. So you're going to be pretty upset with me. But if somebody else was to walk up to you to give you another birthday present and give you a $100 bill, would you take the second one and rip it up and shred it and throw it away? Or would you be willing to give it another shot? You may be hesitant to spend this $100 bill. You may be less excited than you were the first time around. You may be a little bit skeptical. But because the gain is so great, you're willing to try again. And what I'm asking you today is to be able to maybe consider trying again. Consider being able to have one more look at who Jesus is. And while the Christians have given you a lot of fake counterfeit bills, maybe he has a real one for you. In the same way, if you had a really bad math teacher, it would make you maybe not like math, but it wouldn't make you think that the field of mathematics doesn't exist. Let me just start by talking to you about some of the earliest followers of Jesus. So in contrast to maybe what some of you experienced today, and I know that not all Christians are like these bad experiences I'm talking about, and so I'm aware of that. But let's just look at the earliest followers of Jesus. He had 12 disciples. One of them basically is the one that turned him over to the religious leaders to be crucified. So he was out of the fold. Now there was down to 11 followers. Christian tradition tells us of those 11 followers, 10 of them were willing to die for him. He preached a message that was so profound and was so revolutionary that once they saw him rise from the dead, they knew he is for real and he's the truth. And then as you start to go through the earliest, maybe let's say 100, 200 years of Christianity, 300 years of Christianity, what you're going to see is Christians who were tortured. They were fed to lions. They were burned alive. They were beaten up. They had their arms stretched and under various torture things. They went through excruciating pain and torture because of their belief. And they were largely nonviolent. People did all kinds of atrocities to them, but they didn't want fame. They didn't try and get money. They didn't try and get status. Rather, what they chose to do was to take it. Contrary to many of the Christians today who seek fame and money and big jets and big houses, those earlier Christians saw none of those things as worthwhile. There's a really interesting passage in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, which is a book in the Bible. And it basically says, I'm just going to summarize these two sections, but it basically says these early followers of Jesus looked around them and they saw that there was people that were in need. So what they didn't do was go to the government, the Roman authorities, and say, hey, these people are in need. We need you to feed them. We need you to clothe them. We need you to house them. What these early Christians did, and I'm talking early, like you're talking within several years of Jesus's resurrection. They said there's needs, and they started to sell what they had so they could take the profits and buy for what other people needed. Or they gave what they had. They didn't go to the Roman authorities. They took care of the hungry. They took care of the needy around them. That was what they believed and understood after following life with Jesus and being with his followers, that is what Jesus calls them to do. There's an interesting passage in Luke chapter 8, which is another book in the Bible, where Jesus actually challenges those religious people who think that they're so much better than other people. Maybe you know that kind of a person. I want to read you what this little section says, and I think it's brilliant, and I think it's very challenging. So this is what it says, is Luke chapter 18, verse 19. It says, to some who are confident of their own righteousness, their own goodness, and look down on everybody else, Jesus told this story. Two people went up to the temple to pray. One was a religious leader, Jewish man, very well respected, followed all of the rules and the laws, and one was a tax collector. Now, this isn't a really good guy in the culture, and the reason is because the way that they did taxes back then, if you owe, let's say, $300 in taxes, and I'm a tax collector, I'm going to knock on your door, and I'm going to say, you owe $500 in taxes. You really only owe $300, and I know that, but you don't know what you owe. So I'm knocking on your door. I'm saying, you owe the Roman authorities $500 in taxes. So you pay $500. I give Rome $300. I keep $200. So tax collectors were making money by lying and deceiving their own people. So the tax collectors are not very good. Then you got this religious person who's keeping all the laws and says all the prayers and does all the morally right things and believes in God. All this. These are the two you have. So these two people go to the temple to pray. Excuse me. They go to pray. The religious person stood by himself and prayed. And they said, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people. They steal. They do evil things. They're sexually immoral. And thankfully, I'm not like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all that I get financially back. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even bring his eyes to look up to heaven. But instead, with great agony, he said, God, have mercy on me. I'm such a horrible person. And Jesus says, I tell you that this tax collector, this person who didn't keep all the laws, who was doing things that weren't great, this is the one that went home forgiven by God. Because this religious person, there was no genuine acknowledgement of anything they've done wrong. There was just an arrogance that they're so great in comparison to this one. It was a person who came and said, I'm a mess. Can you forgive me? Jesus challenged the arrogance of the religious people. He challenged the pride of the religious people. He challenged the fact that people thought they could look down or treat other people in a different way because they thought they were better than them. He had no tolerance for that. Additionally, Jesus taught humility. There's a beautiful section in what's called the Beatitudes in a chapter called Matthew chapter 5, where it says, blessed are the meek, or those that know that they need God, that they need to be forgiven. Jesus encouraged people to be merciful. And he said, blessed are those who are merciful towards other people. Because people who are followers of Jesus should extend mercy toward people and give people something that they don't deserve. Jesus said, blessed are those that have pure hearts. That's revolutionary. Because in that area, you had clean hands, and pure houses and pure pools to swim in, but you didn't have pure hearts. Your heart meant your mind, your feelings, your will. Jesus says, blessed are those who have pure minds and pure feelings and pure wills. And then when Jesus was captured, when he was arrested, and when he was put on the cross, he's literally being murdered because he was innocent of the charges they were accusing him of. He was literally being murdered, and his words to those who were murdering him were, God, forgive them. Humility, mercy, not striving for fame and money and wealth, forgiveness for those who have hurt you, being willing to die and not fighting back. Jesus was nonviolent. He didn't fight back when they captured him. He didn't start swinging and throwing punches. In fact, one of his followers, when they were being arrested, took a sword or a sword, I believe it was, or a weapon and cut off the ear of one of the people that was trying to arrest Jesus. She said, I don't need you to do that. And he reaches over and he heals the ear of the person who's trying to arrest him. That is the Jesus that I follow. That is the Jesus of Christianity. That may not be the Jesus of the Christians and the churches and the schools that you went to and all of that. But that is the Jesus from his own words, from his own text. That's the real $100 bill. I want to be slightly controversial here as I kind of wind this down. And one of the things that's probably problematic for people when they think about Jesus, that Jesus also forgives the guilty person. In other words, in this room, I ask people to raise their hands if they've been a victim of something. But maybe you're in this room and you're the one who was the perpetrator of some kind of injustice or wrong. Or maybe you're the one that was cruel. Maybe you're the one that mocked somebody, that criticized somebody, that didn't really act like Jesus, even though you hold the name Christian. So I'm just speaking to the Christians in the room right now. Maybe you're somebody who did that. And if you're not a Christian, maybe you are somebody who's just done those horrible things. Maybe you didn't do them in the name of Jesus, but maybe you're just somebody who's done bad things. So Christian or not, if you've done these bad things, I want you to know Jesus does offer forgiveness for you too. And I know that's counter to our culture today, and I get it. But the culture is not my moral authority. And the message of Jesus is that your life is not all about the worst thing you ever did. Your life is not all about your own failures. It doesn't define you. And it doesn't determine how he looks at you. If you are somebody in here who feels like I could never come to God because I am one of those abusers or offenders, I want you to know that admitting what you've done wrong and coming to God and saying, can you forgive me, will result in you having a new identity. It will result in you being forgiven, in you being somebody new. In other words, Jesus offers healing to both the victim and the perpetrator. I want to pause there and make one final comment, and then I'm going to turn it over to Q&A. Ultimately, God isn't confused in any way about whether or not we're good people. He's actually fully aware that we're not. And as a result of that, our badness, Christian or not, whatever you are, all of us as humans, our badness means that we can't be in relationship with God like he originally intended for us to be. Our badness, our bad deeds, our bad actions, our bad thoughts separate us from him. But he doesn't want that. In the very beginning of the Bible, it talks about how when God created the first few humans, how he was close with them. He created them in a garden and was walking with them in the garden. That's a closeness. But the minute humans started doing bad things, it caused a schism. And that schism is not something that God wants permanent, because he didn't create us to be separate. He created us to be with him. And he longs for you. He longs for you. When Christians talk about this cross, they're talking about essentially that it sounds crazy, right? You see people wear crosses around their necks and you're like, this is seriously a way people were tortured. And you're right. But the reason why they do it is because they recognize that the person who was tortured in their place was Jesus himself. It was God himself. Christians believe Jesus is fully God, come down to earth. And the reality is because of all the bad things that we've done, he can't just forgive us because he wouldn't be a good judge. So he has to penalize in order to be a good judge. He can't be a bad judge because he's not morally perfect. He has to be a good judge because he's morally perfect. And he can't just forgive. He's got to carry out punishment. So rather than you take the punishment for what you've done wrong, he takes the punishment on himself. And he comes and he dies. Take the punishment for what you've done on him so that you can therefore come back into relationship with him. When we are spending so much time focusing on our own desires, as if for the Christians in this room, people are missing that message of getting to know, getting to be reunited with God. And for those who are not Christians in this room, I want you to know that that is something that's available for you. Be willing to take another $100 bill. Be willing to try it again. I'm going to bring my friend Logan up here in a second, but do you want to say anything before I do that? Okay. And then we're going to do Q&A.
Yeah, so I think we're just going to jump straight into the Q&A. You guys can still be submitting any of your questions throughout the Q&A. So feel free to be continuing to do that. And I'm just going to introduce our panelists that will hopefully help out answer out some of your questions. It's going to be Logan Gates. He's a PhD candidate in political theory here at U of T, studying the emergence of human rights in early modern political thought. He's an ordained priest in the Anglican Network in Canada and agent speaker with Apologetics Canada, and has spoken on tough questions about the Christian faith on university campuses across the country. So I'm going to welcome both Alycia and Logan Gates back up here. So our first question is not specific to anyone, but is abuse of the Bible at the root of church failures, or would you say there are larger components to it?
Can you repeat one more time? Sorry. Is the abuse of the Bible?
Is abuse of the Bible at the root of church failures, or would you say there are larger components?
Oh, okay.
Do you want to-
I can maybe start. Thank you so much, Alycia. That was really helpful. Is the abuse that's happened through the church, because of the Bible, or is it because of something else? I think, Alycia, what I really appreciate about what she's shared is that when we look at Jesus, we find so much more of a refreshing and a compelling character than when we look at Christians. And so I think this question is really interesting to ask of Jesus, because what I'm struck by is whenever we see Jesus stepping in often to defend those who were being neglected by the religious authorities of the day, he would do it by pointing to the Bible. So for instance, he speaks with these Pharisees who thought they were all great and moral people, and he points out they had this tradition of, in a sense, when you wanted to not care for your parents who were aging, what you could say was, well, all of the savings I have that would go to that, I'm instead going to dedicate it to the temple. And then the money, basically, after I die, will end up in the temple's hands, but in the meantime, I hold on to it. And Jesus takes this abusive practice that was affecting the most vulnerable, those people who Jesus cared about, elderly. And he steps in and he says, actually, you don't understand that though you think you are being so religious and it all fits in with your tradition, that does not fit with how God has designed human society to work. What about that part of the 10 Commandments about honoring your mother and father? And so when I look at Jesus, I see the nobility of his life. I mean, no one really questions that. But I think I'm struck by how high a regard he had for the Bible, that he saw the ethic he lived by as actually what God has been trying to say to humans through his word for centuries, for thousands of years. And I think that challenges me when I look at passages of the Bible that are tricky, and there are many. And if there are some in particular that you're wrestling with, feel free to ask that in the Q&A. I'm sure Alycia would love to speak to them. But I just would say that what gives me pause to jump to the conclusion that what the Bible says is all messed up is just how highly I see Jesus regarding it, how he saw it as actually a tool for liberation and for concern for the marginalized.
Great.
Thank you. So for the next question, it asks, how can we reconcile what we know about Jesus and all the violence that exists in the Old Testament? For example, killing of innocent people.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm a little bit of an Old Testament junkie, so I actually like dealing with a lot of these kind of things. It's a fair question, guys. It's probably one of the most popular questions. I've been doing this 9 years, and I think it's probably one of the most popular questions across the 9 years. If we sit here, we talk about a Jesus who was a pacifist and who was nonviolent towards people and showed compassion and humility and all these kind of things. And then you read the Old Testament and you're like, whoa, okay. God is telling these people to go and destroy these people and to go wipe out these people. And whoa, this seems really backwards. Seems like God in the Old Testament is one way and God in the New Testament seems to be so kind and so loving. Are there two versions of God? Did he change? I think one of the things that's really helpful, and let me just tell you this in a general sense, whenever you look at the Old Testament, I want you to understand that you are looking and reading about cultures that are 4,000 plus or so years ago. Okay. Let me say this, anywhere from 2 to 2,000 and up. Okay. Because Abraham, we think, was probably somewhere around 2000 BC. So yes. So all that to say, these are cultures going to be very different than what you're growing up with in 2023. What you cannot do is read a verse and think you understand what's happening. In order to understand the Old Testament, you have to spend time going into the culture, into the time, understanding what's going on with other cities around it. Because a lot of things that are written there were common amongst other cities and cultures as well. So what seems culturally foreign to us is oftentimes culturally normal to them. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying it helps to look at what's actually happening in the era in that time. So what you essentially have is you have a people that God is going to do great things to. He's going to establish a nation with them. They have been enslaved for 400 years. Okay. And so they were slaves. He frees them from this, sends them out to help develop a nation. But here is the thing. The other nations around aren't doing always really great things. One nation in particular that God actually says, I want you to go in and destroy, had prostitution, which is, some people have different views on that, but stay with me. Prostitution, they also had fidelity in marriage was only bound. The woman was the only one bound to fidelity in marriage. The man could go off and be with whoever he wanted to be with, and that was not an issue, but the woman had to be faithful to him in marriage. They were sacrificing their children by burning them alive as a sacrifice to their God. So their God was a god named Molech, and it's a statue. It had his arms kind of outstretched. They would light a fire and place a baby across its arms and let that baby literally burn to death. Strike up a band to play so they don't hear the baby screaming as it's burning. God sees the horrors and the injustices of what's happening with this particular nation. And he tells his people, I want you to go in there and deal with it. Here is the things we have to understand, guys. God, as the author of life, has certain rights to your life that you don't have. Let me give you a quick example. If I'm, making this like clay sculpture, and it's like, doesn't quite turn around. So I mash it and I do it again. I create something new. I'm like, no, I don't like it. I mash it and do it again. And I do this a couple of times. I'm like, it's not quite how I want it. So I get it. And I'm like, okay, let me just think about this. I'm not sure if I like this present situation. Logan comes over and he bashes it. You guys would look at him and be like, Logan, what are you doing? Like, that was so mean. Why did you just ruin that for her? Why would you say that about Logan, but you didn't say that about me? I ruined it 8 times before Logan came over and ruined it once. Because the difference is, as the author, as the creator of that sculpture, I have different rights when it comes to destruction. Logan doesn't get to destroy something I've made. God is the author of life, is the determiner of it. And the reality is when you hear about God, or when you hear about this nation that's sacrificing their infants, wouldn't God be a monster to sit back and do nothing? Wouldn't we have an issue if we said, God, you're letting these babies burn and you're not helping them? We would get angry with him if he didn't act. And then when he does act, we get angry with him. He never wins. But the reality is, in the Old Testament, there's a lot of evil actions happening in the variety of different nations. God wants it stopped. He doesn't want them to continue to grow in size, influence other nations, push their practices on other nations, and have this become more widespread. He wants it done. And what you see in the New Testament is not something different. What you see in the New Testament is you see God carrying out judgment for the evil and the wrongs that people do. All that changes between the Old Testament and the New Testament is on whom the judgment falls. In the Old Testament, the judgment for what people have done wrong falls on them. You've done these evil things, God deals with them. Strikes them dead, tells people to go in and wipe them out, whatever it might be. In the New Testament, God sees evil and injustice, and he says, I'm done with it. But this time, he carries the punishment out on Jesus. It's the same God who carries out judgment on evil in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. All that's different is on whom the judgment falls. He's a God of love and mercy in the Old Testament. He let them be enslaved for 400 years before he finally carried out justice on the slave owners. He gave them time. Love and merciful in the Old, and he's loving and merciful in the New.
Actually, this next question kind of adds perfectly to that. Since God is a perfect judge, there must be a punishment for sins, but why is the punishment of hell eternal?
Oh,
Thank you. That's a real question. I think maybe there are two things that I found helpful wrestling with this. I think one is to think about, how do we in general determine the severity of any crime? And so this is kind of humorous. Forgive me for going light here before going deep in a hard question. But there's a Mr. Bean episode where Mr. Bean meets the Queen. Maybe you've seen it. And he's trying to get all presentable before the Queen. And so he's like adjusting himself, but then he realizes he's got like a button falling off. And anyhow, it's quite humorous. He's panicking because the Queen is walking down a receiving line and shaking people's hands. And they're bowing to the Queen. And so finally, in the last minute, he gets himself all ready. And the Queen comes to him, and what does he do? He bows, but he bows in such a way that he knocks her with his head, and she topples over backwards. It's a funny scene. Why is it so funny? I mean, it's one thing if I did that to a random person on the street or my grandmother, but because it's the Queen, it is mortifying. And it's mortifying not because the action is any different, but because of the authority and the dignity of the person against whom that action was committed. And so when we think about why violating a child is such a big deal, why it's worse than even, two guys getting into a fist fight, it has to do with the sacredness and the dignity of the child. And if we think then about what makes God who God is, I think we can only think of what Alycia spoke about, of his authority. He's made us, his total purity and majesty. And that all of a sudden makes what might seem to be a minor thing that we did that maybe wasn't great to be something that God actually takes very seriously. I think that's the first thing I would say. But the question also gets on this eternal aspect. And I mentioned this yesterday in the talk, so forgive me if you were here yesterday and you'll hear this again. But I've been really helped here through the writing of C.S. Lewis about what heaven and hell actually mean. Lewis pointed out that in the Christian understanding, what makes heaven heaven is that God is present there. everything beautiful about this life are things that bring joy and happiness and love, if all those things from the Christian perspective come from God, imagine being with that face to face. That's what makes heaven heaven. But what makes hell hell in the Christian understanding is the absence of God. It's not so much guys wearing red tights, dressed up as devils with, horns. It's actually that God is completely and utterly absent. And with God, all the joy and love and things that we experience in this life, all of that is taken away. But how is this relevant? Well, because the question is, what exactly would a loving God do if he wanted to have a relationship with his creatures? Now, when I asked my wife to marry me, I didn't do it by, holding out a ring and then on the other hand, a gun and asking, would you marry me? I love you so much. Because of course, for it to be a genuine marriage, she needs to have the chance to say no to me. And I think if that's how human relationships work, why is it not the case with God? Wouldn't a loving God look to us and say, I won't force you to be in this relationship with me. I have laid down my life and done whatever it would take that you would see my care for you, but I can't force you. And I think with what hell is, it's God giving us the chance to say no to him, as scary and dark and fearful a thing as that is. I mean, C.S. Lewis says, could it be the case that the door to hell is locked from the inside? I think that for me really coupled with this idea of judgment. On the one hand, you have a holy God. A judge can't be a good judge unless there is punishment for injustice. But at the same time, here's a God who loves me, wants to give me the chance to say yes to me. And he has shown me by giving his own life that he's done everything to try to make that possible, apart from forcing my will. I think it's a tough question. I have questions for God when I see him, but I think that for me helps me see how actually it fits with his justice, and I think it fits with his love as well.
Thank you so much for that. I believe that's all the time we have for today for questions, but if you guys have any more questions, I believe we can still submit them to something that will have come up, and we'd love to hear your guys' feedback as well. I believe there's going to be a QR code. You can access it and to fill it out for feedback and a follow-up form, and you can also register for something called Christianity Explore, which if you want to explore more about Christianity, we have any more of your questions regarding faith, God, and life, that's a great resource to use. And I believe we have a video to be playing for that. Okay.
A committed Christian, or somewhere in between.
Perhaps lots of questions to ask, or perhaps it could be significant. Maybe a church, or maybe a religion. Whoever, Christianity is one of the first to explore what life is all about. The Christianity is not it's relaxed and important. And it's not like ordinary people. Some would say I'm a church and lots of people. Some are helping people service and just to keep friends getting together. Wherever it is, in each session, there's a chance to look at one of the people to yourself and ask any question you have. There's a talk video to watch, and then there's lots of out of you only ask us to stay, pray, or read out, and then to know anything about God and me.
To be a Christianity Explored course starting near you soon. So ask a Christian friend, or check out the website to find out more. You might just discover that the Christian message really is the best news you've ever heard.
If you have any more questions, that's a great resource to check out, and please submit your feedback. And if you guys want to check out more information about the Relevant series, there's actually another talk in the same location here, which will be a interfaith dialogue between a Christian and Muslim. So that's definitely something interesting to check out. Thank you so much, Alycia and Logan, for taking your time here to speak tonight. And there's the rest of the events. So there's one this evening, tonight happening 7 to 9. And then we have tomorrow our last two events. So it'd be really great if you guys could check those out. And thanks so much for attending today. It was great seeing you, and hopefully you guys had your questions answered. And if not, I definitely encourage to go attend the other ones. There's some really interesting and good topics. So yeah, thank you.
you.